Pleasure to have all of you. We'll do a round of intros in a bit. For anyone joining, we have a panel here today to talk about how to scale data-driven content. Really the focus of this webinar will be how to prove your product's value or your service's value with data. And we've got a great team here of folks who've done just that, scaling data-driven content in their organization. So thank you all for joining. I'll get started with a round of intros, and then I will go round robin and name y'all off. But I'm Spencer Davison. I head up the account management team at Matic, and I'm joined today by Connor, Emily, and Jonathan. We'll start with Connor Kelly. Connor, feel free to give an intro, your name, title, and your company. We'd love to hear a bit about what your company does, and then if you want to lead us off from there and talk about an area in your travel bucket list, now that we have summer coming up and people will be doing more traveling, that'd be great. So Connor, feel free to get us kicked off.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks, Spencer. Hey, everybody. My name is Connor Kelly. I'm a senior scaled insights analyst at Asana, which is a work management platform for teams to collaborate on tasks, projects, and goals. And our sales and customer success teams use Matic to generate presentations and one-pagers to share usage data with their customers, either by email or during business reviews. And so at the top of my travel bucket list, I'd say have to be South Korea. I'm an avid bicyclist. So South Korea actually has a bike trail that runs from Seoul in the north to Busan in the south. So that's definitely at the top of my list to see it by bike.
Nice. Always wanted to visit there. I don't know if I'll ever get the chance, but sounds beautiful. Great. Let's move over to Emily Smith from Hummingbird.
Thank you. Yeah, so like you said, my name is Emily Smith. I am the manager of CS operations and strategy at Hummingbird. Hummingbird is a CRM platform and case management platform for like financial compliance teams. So analysts are using us to fight money laundering, to fight fraud inside of our platform. And primarily our CS team, I've implemented Matic for 2 different CS teams at 2 different companies. And right now we're actually working to also bring our sales team into it, which is exciting. And I would say top of my bucket list is going to have to be the Scottish Highlands for sure.
Oh, nice. Yeah. I was just talking about haggis with someone. That is Scottish, right? No, that's Irish.
Yeah.
No, I was talking about Scottish eggs with someone. How it's
yeah.
But always wanted to visit there. Great, Jonathan. You want to round us home here?
Yeah, definitely. Jonathan Brown. I'm Senior Director of Customer Strategy at Zuora. We are the subscription, billing, and revenue recognition leaders, quote to cash. So my travel, we use Matic. We have a number of CSM and sales use cases, mostly around like business reviews. Also our upsell team, we have an upsell team where we do a lot of data-driven upsells. We also finding a lot of internal use cases around like internal QBRs and sales decks as well. So my travel bucket list, I have 3 little kids, the oldest of which is 4. So my bucket list is literally anywhere where I can ever relax again on a vacation. I think it's going to be a while, but that's my bucket list. I don't care where, as long as I can actually take a break.
So definitely not Disneyland or Disney World, I take it.
No, yeah. No.
Awesome. Well, pleasure to have all of you, and thank you for joining. So I'd love to jump right into it and start talking about data-driven content at your organization. So we'll go in that same order, but I'd love to talk about what data-driven content your company creates today. And so this is more content that is going in front of your customers. I'd love to hear in as much detail as you'd like to provide what kind of content you're creating and getting in the hand of your customers.
Awesome. Cool. So I'll go first. So here at Asana, our account teams use Matic to share usage data with customers. This is things like user growth, feature adoption, benchmarking to show performance versus peers, and then things like ROI insights. I'd say, and for our templates, they really boil down to two different types. There are one-pagers that are more meant for like asynchronous communications, think like things to attach to emails. And then we have full-on slide decks for more like business review style meetings. And so a couple examples of those async one-pager templates are like a check-in template, which is kind of like quick hits of usage over the past month or two, mostly meant for either like prepping a customer in advance of a meeting or trying to re-engage either a prospect that's gone cold or a net new prospect. And then we have like a year in review style one pager, which was originally meant to be like a fun touch point during the holidays, but it's kind of evolved into like a pre-renewal rundown over the past year. And then we have those full-on business review style templates that are like full slide decks that are really meant to facilitate business reviews. But then we also have specific types of templates like onboarding check-ins or contract renewal style templates that are more meant for specific parts of the customer journey. And then lastly, we have what we call packets, which are basically slide decks that are drill downs on certain topics. And so while the business review, which is like our core template, has kind of like a high level overview of all sorts of types of customer usage data and different value propositions. Each of these packets is a drill down into one specific type of data. And so here at Asana, we integrate with like over 100 different apps. And so many of our customers, for example, might be very interested in how they're integrating with other apps or a specific app they're integrating with. So we have a packet that is a drill down on integrations. And so depending on whether the customer is interested in that, our account teams can go and download that packet and share all of that information. And so I'd say the last thing in terms of the types of content that we're trying to explore or produce is around conditionality. And so a really cool thing about Matic is that you can actually conditionally send out content or generate content based on specified inputs in the generation process. And so our marketing team is currently exploring whether we can actually distribute and kind of prescribe different marketing materials based on a customer profile. And so what this would do for us is basically prevent situations where our sales and customer success teams can't find specific materials, and we can actually take in those requirements and make sure that we prescribe them the right materials for that customer profile.
Great. Yeah, I love the segmentation there. Do you feel like you are providing a lot of data just from the platform, or is it kind of taking that data and then changing it to like what the perceived value is, or providing calculations on that data to show the value for your customer?
Yeah, that's a good question, Spencer. I'd say it's probably a mix of both. We kind of, I guess through Matic, we share direct product usage data. So things like, here's how many users you have, here's how many of what action they're taking. But then we also do things like build ROI calculations ourselves based on that usage data and kind of perform those calculations all in Matic so that we take that raw usage data and translate it into something that's a little bit more value driven.
That's great. Thank you. Emily, so same question for you. I would love to kind of talk about what kind of data-driven content you're creating today.
Yeah, so kind of like I said, when I was introing, I've actually implemented data-driven content at two different companies at two very different stages of, I would say, data development. So the first time that I rolled this out, we had very robust data lake, very robust BI tool. And so what I was doing was taking kind of this great foundation of stuff and creating content. Whereas right now we're sort of doing both at the same time. And so data-driven content comes from not just application data and information from what the customer is doing, but also our partnership information. So speaking more towards currently at Hummingbird, where we work almost exclusively with extremely large enterprise clients. So we're not doing a whole lot of small automated stuff just yet. We're very high touch with all of our customers. So what we're working on right now, a lot similar to what Connor said, we've got like data-driven content in pretty much every deck that we have with our customers. Our kickoff call has data-driven content in it based on what was in the contract. based on what we know of their use cases going into it, based on what their service model is going to be. Then as they move into training, we also do data-driven content in there, depending on what type of training they're doing. We put different information into the deck, because when you're training an analyst, it's very different than when you're training an admin. And so showing them the important things, the important markers that they should be looking for is going to be one of the biggest things we put in those decks. And then as we move out of implementation and sort of hand off the account, because we do very formal, long implementations, we hand off to our customer success team. And what we allow them to do is in that we do what's called 30, 60, 90s, which is basically just monthly check-ins for the first 3 months of the account. And in those, we do what I call baby QARs, where we let the CSM, very similar to what Connor was talking about, kind of say, these are my use cases. And so it will let them pick which metrics they want to show to their customers. And what that allows is this sort of like build up into the QAR, which once you get out of that 90 days, you then move into the bulk of where that data-driven content comes in. And then we're also working right now on our renewal decks, which is going to pull in piecemeal things from that QAR deck, and then also add in, you know, all of the, what have you missed by not having these other features in the platform? How much money have you wasted because you're trying to do it internally, right? So we pretty much have data-driven content through the entirety of the life cycle. And then kind of the last thing that's on the roadmap is, of course, then distilling that into a one-pager like Connor talked about.
That's great. I think having data-driven content aligned to the life cycle makes it a lot easier to construct those insights, because you know what those touch points are, and you know what conversations you want to be having. So that's great to hear. How has the journey been to get some of that data and transforming it to insights? Have you been working with engineering and data teams to get that up and running?
Yeah. So I work with both the engineering team, and I always go back to my CSMs, because the CSMs are going to be the ones who tell you the story. They're going to be the ones who tell you what's important to the customers. Your engineers are great. They are not going to know what a customer wants to hear. They're not going to know, for example, with our platform, logins, not really a helpful metric. It has almost no indicator of the health of the account. So an engineer might be like, here's your login information. And I'm going to be like, CSMs have zero interest in that. So I work with the engineering team, where right now they're doing a lot of work of building that data lake to make sure that we have a consistent place where everyone, regardless if they're using my BI tool or Matic or Salesforce or whatever, we're all getting the same numbers when we run those queries. So that's what they're working on right now. And then I will say the other piece of information kind of in the meantime, when you're waiting on engineering, is there's tons of information that you can show about your partnership, which we do a lot for our customers. One of our biggest value adds is what we will help them do from a regulation standpoint. And so a lot of our data-driven content actually shows, how often did we let you work with one of our technical solutions engineers, which saved you money because your engineering team wasn't doing it? How many of your feature requests have we built? How many different times has the CSM worked with you to improve your workflows, right? And so we can show all of that data while we're waiting for the metrics data to get fully fleshed out.
Got it. Yeah, I like what you said, especially in the beginning. And I think it's often lost where, you know, there must be like a business need behind the insights, and worst place you can get into is when you're just showing data to
Numbers.
show data. Yeah, or showing, yeah. And I've seen like overkill on slides too, where it's like, you know, too much, you know, analysis paralysis happening without takeaway. So that's great to hear. Thank you, Jonathan. So I'd love to hear about the insights your company is creating today. And then kind of a follow-on to that, which would be a question I ask all of you, is why is this content important to your customers? So if you want to kind of treat that as a two-part question, Jonathan, love to hear your thoughts.
Sure, yeah. Definitely. I'm actually learning so much listening to these guys. We're not quite as far along on our Matic journey as these other panelists are. But two really critical use cases that have really hit the mark for us. The first general one has been upsells, right? So Zuora is a big platform play, right? We do billing, we do payments, we do revenue recognition. We just acquired like a front end subscriber experience offer management product, right? And so we usually land, with one or two of those products, and then the kind of the virtuous cycle is that the usage data that the customer generates is easily mined to make the case to buy more products, right? So we have an upsell team that is very data driven. So there's actually like some data talent that sits on that team and rolls up to sales. We have a data engineering team. We're all very tightly collaborating on what are the metrics we can query that show an ROI for these new products that we can sell our customers. The other use case that's really hit for us that dovetails well into the next question is benchmarks. Since we're a financial system of record, we actually have like some of the most valuable data about these businesses that they could possibly track, right? We're talking like ARR, MRR, we're talking billings, we're talking payment success. And so when we're able to aggregate those numbers and show a customer's data against like benchmarked against a cohort of their peers, it's a really great conversation starter. So we're really trying to become much more value oriented is kind of our mantra at Zuora. And the benchmarks especially, if you try to go to a customer and say, tell me what value you want to get out of Zuora, or like, tell me what value you've gotten out of Zuora over the last year. Like they're going to immediately just, be like, no, like get out of here. We don't want to talk to you about that. Right. But if you tell them, hey, we have benchmarks and we can show you how you compare against your peers, everybody wants to talk about that. Right. Like, I don't care how angry your customer is at you or how much they hate your product. Like they're going to want to see benchmarks, especially when you're talking like MRR, ARR, when you're talking like FTE numbers to process your billings, like that kind of data is super valuable. And it's almost like a Trojan horse, right? To get them to start talking about the value that they're expecting out of Zuora. So.
I love that because it's this concept around like this type of content that's push or pull. It's either they really want it and they're asking for it, or you're trying to push it to them because it's around the narrative you're trying to tell. But I think when you can do both, it's a high value narrative for you because it kind of fits within what you're trying to guide the customer through. And it's something that they find really valuable, like benchmarks, because everybody wants to see where they sort of stack rank. That's when you can kind of have the best of both worlds.
Yep.
That's great. Connor, yeah, I'd love to hear from you on like why the content you create is important for your customers.
For sure. Yeah. And so I guess I'll kind of take this question in two parts and talk a little bit about it internally, and then I'll kind of talk about what that means for our customers that we serve as Asana. And so I think like internally, one of the biggest things with Matic is just how much more efficient it's made our sales teams. And so just some like preliminary numbers, we did some like just for internal purposes, trying to figure out how much time we're saving through Matic. And we've estimated that like before Matic, it took like 2.5 hours to put together a business review, get the data, build the presentation. And with Matic, it's generated in minutes, right? And so what that allows us to do, other than save a ton of time, is that it allows us to be so much more thoughtful with how we build our narratives and how we think about our accounts and build that strategy. And ultimately that leads to us building deeper relationships with our customers. And so echoing a little bit about what Jonathan made, one of those things that I think customers love to hear is benchmarking. So we've done a lot of work to just build out a methodology for trying to build cohorts for a specific customer, and then also just kind of like share across several different parts of the Asana platform, where they're getting extra value or where maybe there's an opportunity to increase value. And so this is both beneficial for us in that it makes them better users of Asana, but also it helps lead to better business outcomes for our customers. And so I think freeing up the time for our account teams to be much more thoughtful and build that strategy for their accounts is mutually beneficial. And then I think like one other thing that I just mentioned is that we've also done a lot of work. And one of the things that our customers really like to hear is about like projections. So like projections about usage growth and seeing that, because it leads to more deeper discussions around what does the future look like for our accounts. And so we've actually been able to do this through Matic. And so we've been able to scale user growth projections, and we're looking at scaling ROI projections. And ultimately, that's helpful because it helps align expectations with our customers, and also helps their IT teams plan for increased usage and just like give them further insight into not just like what is your user growth right now, but what is that going to look like moving forward?
I love projections, and we don't do it enough. But when you can put on like the Nostradamus hat, they tend to like that, especially if it aligns with their business and their business goals. That's great to hear. Emily, I'd love to hear from you on what your customers find really valuable about the content you're creating today.
Yeah. So right now at Hummingbird, I think one of the biggest value adds that we have from our data-driven content is that we almost never have a CFO or the ultimate financial decision maker on the call. It's usually we've got the head of compliance, which they may love us. They may love every second of being in our platform. But when they go to a CFO, or if they leave the company and someone else comes in, this person doesn't know anything about our platform. And so that data-driven content for the kind of key stakeholders who really want to keep Hummingbird, who really want to keep using us, having clear and very narrative data-driven content that you can very easily, either in a one-pager or in just a PDF of a deck, give to a CFO with your renewal quote, with your invoice that's coming up, right? The ability to present that information extremely easily to them in a really digestible way. We also do email data-driven content as well. So sending out those executive stakeholder summaries of the account as well. And what we find is that the more we can get that information really distilled, really simple for a CFO who's you have 30 seconds to explain to me why you want Hummingbird, even though it might be more expensive than a few other competitors. And so really working to show data that shows we're one of the few platforms that can help aggregate the number of cases that you have being created. So instead of having 100 cases created, we automatically put any that are together. So you're actually working 50 cases instead of 100, right? So the ability to show those efficiencies, show how we're increasing their ability to do better work in the platform, showing a reduction in maybe the number of sessions that an analyst has within our platform to complete an action, showing that reduce over time, showing certain ratios reduce or increase depending on what the metric is over time. These are things that if you go and you show to a CFO, immediately helps them see great, sure, absolutely. And then the other piece, kind of going back to what I was saying about showing our partnership, how effective we are there. One of the interesting things about our platform is that we also are driven by what US regulators are saying that we have to do. So what we're able to show is we will help them navigate and work with these national huge institutions and make sure that they are compliant just by using our platform. And so we can show that hey, you didn't have to call this regulator and sit on the phone for X amount of hours. We did that for you, right? And so showing the value add of just the partnership itself as data-driven content. Again, all of this goes back to just showing that great, you are justifying the invoice that I have on my desk in front of me.
Yeah, I like the way you put it, because it's sort of you're kind of building the picture for them, building the puzzle, and each of the little puzzle pieces are the insights you're creating. But it needs to be like a whole thought, right? You can't just, to Jonathan's point, jump to a big value number and be like, this is the ROI you're getting, without guiding them along that journey. Otherwise, it won't be as well received as if you build that picture. Great. Well, that was all really helpful context. We're going to get a little bit into process now when it comes to really building this out from the business need and to how it takes to actually get that data to a valuable insight to that business need. So would love to, and Jonathan, if you could kick this one off, really talk about the process for creating this type of content today. Now, you don't need to get into very technical detail, but
Yeah.
I think this is the biggest challenge, and I think people would really like to hear how this process is working for everyone. So, Jonathan.
Yeah, totally. Let me know if this is hitting the mark on what you're looking for. But basically, like all of our ideas, I mean, it just starts with manual querying and spreadsheets and just like piloting the idea, right? Because Matic is really a tool for operationalizing. It's not really a tool for like experimentation. And so most of the the upsell pitches or the new benchmark, if we have a new benchmark that comes out, for the first 5, 10, sometimes even 20 presentations, it's our data science team, our data engineering team, myself, manually like sifting through the data, trying to figure out what is the right benchmark, the right way to filter it, especially when you get into things like payment data, where there's so many different reason codes and a lot of complexity there. It can take a while to really shake out, what is the right metric that's not going to cause your customer to go down a rabbit hole of trying to like ask all these questions that get you off track, right? From there, we do have a pretty robust data engineering team. Right now, it hasn't always been the case with a lot of like decent data pipelines established. So I say like 50% of the time we can get what we need out of those data pipelines, and the other 50% of the time, we're creating net new metrics, and that is a ticket with the data engineering team, getting into their Jira queue, managing that work gets done, and doing the QA work to get the data feed pumped into Matic, where we can then build it out. I think at that point the data is pretty clean by the time it hits Matic, so building it out there is usually not such a heavy lift. So that's kind of like the full food chain at Zuora. Is that what you're looking for, Spencer?
Whoops, sorry. Yes, that is absolutely what we were looking for.
Cool.
And one part I really want to hone in on that I think is a step that a lot of people miss is what you said around piloting and making sure it works, or it's the type of narrative or the type of insight that is valuable. I think oftentimes that step is skipped, and it's immediately is okay. Well, we're making the assumption that this is valuable, but you get a lot of valuable feedback when you pilot something in front of the field, and it's part of your go-to-market strategy, and then going into a question we'll ask later, then you decide to scale it. So yeah, would love to hear Connor, your thoughts on what your process is at Asana for creating this type of content.
Yeah, for sure. I think in an ideal world, everything would be scaled in Matic, and we could allow our account teams, our sales and customer success folks to self-service. But just at this moment, that's not feasible. There's always, new prompts, new customer meetings, executive business reviews where we need to take, an extra, we need to provide extra support. And so when that happens, and there's something that prompts some ad hoc, more strategic analysis that we just don't have available in Matic right now, it's a pretty large process, I'd say. It calls for defining the requirements with the account team, really meeting with that account team to understand the account history, understand the nuances and quirks, and really try to identify, what we're looking for. Sometimes, a customer wants to prove there's a network effect with our product, or sometimes they're just looking for a new fresh take on ROI. And so when that happens, I'd say, similar to what Jonathan mentioned, a lot of ad hoc queries are built, a lot of exploration, a lot of quality checking happens. I'd say one of the primary perks of Matic, and why I say things like in an ideal world, everything would be scaled, is that, when these things are done in an ad hoc fashion, or just like more of a one-off case, I'd say it produces a greater likelihood for human error, and it really requires more of like a fine touch. Whereas in Matic, it really just takes building it out once and feeling really confident in it. And then since it's automated, there's just less of a likelihood for things like, when putting it into a spreadsheet, a cell to get dropped or something like that. So I'd say, all in all, that's kind of like the process we go through for those ad hoc things. But then ultimately, I think what we see is that when we do go through these exercises and we find something that works with a customer, we try to scale it as soon as possible. Because I think one of the primary benefits of once we do identify putting together some content for like a unique customer scenario that ends up being not so unique, and maybe a couple other customer success managers get wind of it and they test it with their customers, is that we can then make it available for all of our sales and customer success folks. So that's typically what we try to do, is take those one-off kind of like ad hoc content creation opportunities and then scale them in Matic.
I love what you said around taking something ad hoc and then being like, okay, when can I spin this up that people will find a lot of value? On that point, do you feel like you more often than not, when people are bringing ideas to you, they're like bespoke ideas that wouldn't scale, or do you feel more often than not they're actually something that is worth exploring and you can potentially create something bigger out of it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Spencer. I'm going to give you not so clear of an answer and say it really depends. I'd say it's almost 50-50. We definitely have a bias towards scaled processes. And we definitely, when we're defining requirements with customers, try to figure out where the opportunity is for scale. But I think it really depends on the customer, right? Like I think for some of our strategic larger customers, it's perhaps not as feasible to scale as it would be for like, the rest of our customers, where we can kind of like get those high level things that kind of like those 20% of insights that fit 80% of our customers. That's really where we see the opportunities for scaling.
Got it. Yeah. It's always a bit of a mixed bag, but when you do find that golden idea and you're like, wow, I never thought about that before. Usually it's something simple you're like, why didn't I ever think about that in that way before? That it's always those simple ideas that are like, that you feel like should have been no-brainers that are typically like the biggest impact. Because they feel like they're no-brainers, but this just takes a little bit of a different perspective sometimes to get that idea. Great. Emily, I'd love to hear about your process over at Hummingbird. I know you guys are really on the more of the beginning phase of starting to stage out this process, but we'd love to hear what that's looking like for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So for context, we're about a year in to starting all of this very much from scratch. One of the things that I think is a little bit different about how I approach things, I moved into ops from being a CSM. And I also come into SaaS with a lot of like soft skill, theatrical background. And so for me, everything starts from a lens of what story are you telling? And so when I started at Hummingbird, before I ever worried about starting a deck, picking metrics, right? I had to understand our customer use cases. And so most of what I did to start was listening to calls, just being on as many shadow calls as I could possibly be, listening to what different stakeholders at different levels, what did technical resources wanted, what did project managers want, what did, the high up CCOs at these companies, what do they want to see, right? Really analyzing those use cases and starting first, because when you're choosing data-driven content, prioritizing that is huge, and not just going to your engineering team with like a laundry list, which I've absolutely also done. But what I did was basically look at, okay, what are the use cases that hit the most of our book? Prioritize those at the top. Okay, what are the things, I'd meet with our PMs, I'd meet with even like our CEO, just really to understand how do we prove to our customers that we are doing this thing. When we say, hey, you should use us because you want to increase efficiency in your investigations, cool, prove it, right? And trying to find those metrics first. My VP, who is who I answer to, always laughs at me because sometimes when I get stuck, I'll be like, okay, pitch this to me. Tell me the story. What is a customer success manager saying when they're on this slide? What is the story that they're telling? Because what is never helpful and a customer never wants to see, kind of like I said earlier, is just numbers up on the screen, where all you're really doing on the call is reading those numbers. Send them the deck. That didn't need to be a call, right? So if you're having the call, the purpose of it is to enable your CSMs in that moment to use that data to launch an action, to change something about the account, to make a recommendation on the account, or be like, look at this, I'm hitting your use cases. This is exactly, I am proving it. We have our CSMs very early in the journey say, what are the things that I need to be able to show you in 6 months that will make you say you're glad you purchased us? And so the ability to then use data for those 6 months to prove that case over and over and over again. So yeah, again, kind of going back to the process, I start with first, again, making sure that I understand what story are we telling? Who are we telling that story to? How is it different if you're on a renewal and you're talking to just the executive stakeholders, or if you're on a training and you're talking to those analysts, right? That's a wildly different conversation with wildly different metrics. And then beyond that, it's really simple, similar to what Connor was talking about, which is you meet with your engineers. When I did this at my last company, I met with the engineer that was assigned to this project every week. He would give me sort of his first pass at the SQL query. I also recommend knowing a little bit of SQL if you're sort of heading this up. You don't need to be able to write it from scratch. But the number of times that I've looked at a query and been like, does this include when this random scenario happens? And they're like, no, it doesn't. And you're like, cool, how can it, right? So a lot of QA work, a lot of QA work, a lot of QA work. And then also doing a lot of work to making sure that the information is being defined properly by your CSMs or by the person running the call. Can't tell you the number of times that I've listened to calls and heard a CSM be like, this is the number of this that you have, which means this. And it's a completely wrong definition of what that metric is. So you can't forget about the enablement part of this process, which is making sure that your CSMs or whoever's running that call has a like in their bones understanding of what this means and what the impact of it is.
Yeah, and that's probably the biggest challenge, and it's a good segue for us. But before we move over to our last question, I think I really want to highlight what you said on the data storytelling. This might sound blasphemous, but I think the storytelling is much more important part of that phrase than the data. Because of what you said, if you don't have like an emotional resonance with what you're actually speaking to, and you're just saying numbers and narratives mixed together, but you're not actually telling a story, and there needs to be a story. And if the only way that something's a story is if it has an arc, right? And so I'm sure your background in theater has helped you there. Like you said, there needs to be some sort of narrative building and an arc to your story to have a call to action, and not just have data intermixed with a slide that goes in order.
Yeah, understanding call flow is sort of another thing that I would kind of plug as well, which is like, as an example, we show here were the use cases, here's where the measures of success. Now let's go into the metrics that directly back up those things. And then we go directly into, okay, what are the action items because of what we just talked about? Either because we're meeting them or because there's a very easy action item that came from looking at that content.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I almost wish that there was like a gong feature where every time there was that moment where they're like, oh, I love that data point, like gong, or something along those lines. Obviously, they would never say that exact phrase. But that would be like, oh, then that's,
If they would though.
yeah, yeah, some of them would. Great. So Emily, we'll stick with you for this last question and then go over to Jonathan and Connor. But would love to hear about how you go about the scaling piece of data-driven content. So you know what you want to build, your engineers, you validated it, you've gone through the proof of concept with it, you built a template. And then what is the process today to actually get that in the hands of the people, your customer success managers, and eventually your customers, so that they can actually start using it? Would love to hear what your process is today for that, Emily.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing that I do when I'm making a deck, I mean, one of the nice things about Matic is that like once you have it, you just start building for it. So like every time I'm adding a field in Salesforce, my brain is like, how can I use this as a conditional formatting rule in Matic? Everything I ask for, everything I build in any platform is like, how can I use this to choose slides, things like that. And so when I'm in the deck, I usually have one of the first things that I do is make sure that there are various versions of slides based on really important segmentation. And so once I understand what that segmentation is, I mean, if you look at any of my decks in the speaker notes, it's just like, this is for customers with this, and then it'll be like 4 more versions of that slide. And again, what's so nice about Matic is that then the CSM doesn't have to do that work. They don't have to think about it. They just have to be like, cool, this is the slide I present to this customer. So again, as I'm building the deck, I'm considering all of those things. How am I going to segment? How can I make this perfect for all of our different unique use cases? And then, honestly, the Matic part is relatively simple. Once you have the queries, once you have the connection to, if you use Salesforce, which is what we use, creating those queries is relatively simple. I mean, it is, time consuming in the sense of like, you have to be really detail oriented. But I will get in there, always follow good ops rules, write a description. Don't look at my account. There's probably not as many descriptions as there should be. Write descriptions. I also prefer the method of having unique queries for specific decks, mainly because we've talked a lot about like different types of metrics for different parts of the customer journey, but a lot of times I'm also showing different time frames of data, slightly different takes on metrics. So for example, a renewal deck is going to have information for the life of that contract, whereas a QAR is going to have information for the last 2 quarters or the last quarter. Whereas a monthly check-in call might have information just since you went live, right? So it's all of those queries are going to be unique. So usually I'm duplicating, making specific for how zeroed into this deck and this use case and this purpose can I be. And then, again, testing is a huge thing. I probably have, if you look at my Google Drive, hundreds of presentations that are generated under my name of me testing slides, testing, you've got to test how do formatting works. I mean, even coming down to choosing when do you write the whole number versus when do you write 56K, things like that. So yeah, that's how I go about it. The nice thing, again, the whole point of scaling and the nice thing with Matic is once you've trained your team once on Matic, you throw a new deck in there, you don't have to do it. Like they just know how to do it. You just tell them when to use the deck. I also really love it because it gives me control over when those decks change. We're no more of this, who changed this slide? When did it change, right? Only our Matic admins have permission to edit those decks. And so we can be very specific about when we roll out changes, when the CSM see new metrics. So that is.
No, I love it. I'd love to ask you one follow-up on, Matic is pretty intentionally easy for end users where they're going in. They've got all of their different narratives that they can produce with custom insights. But you mentioned something around the making sure they really have the story down, and that they're not being in a sticky situation where they're presenting a slide that they don't really know, but like what it actually means. What's your process for enablement on that end?
Yeah. So highly recommend using speaker notes if you're using Google Slides. It's number one thing to just like have something in there that says like, this is what this metric means. I also do that we have a roadmap slide. And so I'll have like very specific, here's what we mean by this like 3-word description of this feature that's coming out. So we definitely do that. And then if there are like large changes from enablement, we do use an LMS called WorkRamp. And so I will have my CSMs do an updated guide. And then I always recommend force them to pitch it. Don't have the first time that they do this in front of someone be in front of a client. That is recipe for disaster. So either having them pitch live to their manager, to you, to each other, however you want to do it. If you have an LMS, they can record it, do a Loom, right? Like however you want them to do it. But saying to them, I want you to go into Matic. I want you to generate a real deck. That way they're not doing duplicate work. They don't feel like they're doing something just for an exercise. And then having them actually do it and providing really helpful feedback, and also not being offended if they don't explain something well enough, because it might mean that you didn't explain it well enough. So taking that back and being like, okay, how can I make that more clear? Or going back to them and saying, you seemed a little tripped up by this moment. Is that because it was a one-off and it took you by surprise? Or was it you feel there's something weird in this order, and maybe using that to improve your deck?
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think what you said that's most resonant is just listening to what works and what's not, and being open to that feedback and constantly iterating. Great. Well, I thank you all for your feedback. You guys have had so much great insights to share with us about data insights that we're running short on time, and we do have a pretty packed Q&A, or just a queue in the backlog that we'd love to get to. So why don't we move over to that, and that'll probably answer some more questions for that we were going to get to during the webinar anyways. So would love to switch over to that. So why don't we we'll get some first few answers on this. So the first question, I love the idea of Matic and want it for my team. I'm just concerned about how messy our data is. How did you all overcome messy data? Jonathan, I feel like I'm going to put you on the spot here.
Sure.
You have a good answer on this one that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think, and probably this applies to a lot of those questions, is you can't let perfect be the enemy of good in a lot of these situations. I know I dream up metrics all the time of like, oh, it'd be perfect if we could just show exactly this kind of metric on this data point, and then you dig in, you realize it's not as clean as you want it to be, but you can still get something out of it, right? Maybe it doesn't tell this perfect story that you're emotionally attached to in your head because you came up with it yourself, right? And so I think just kind of like embracing the mess, right? And just seeing there's this happy medium between driving your data team or your engineering team to improve the data feeds, but also just using what's there, because usually what's there is 80% good enough, and that's at the end of the day, customers they've never seen the data before, right? The metric is the metric is the metric. So yeah, I think it's like getting out of your own head and just trying to make the most of what you got.
That's great. Yeah, and if you feel like your data integrity is lacking, I think from my experience, it can be helpful forcing function as you think about scaling content in any form. it's a process to fix that and figure out what matters, what doesn't matter. And then as a result, your data will be hopefully clean by the end. And that's something that we've seen as well. So, but that's very helpful background, Jonathan. Connor, I'll position this one to you. We have a lot of in-house systems and tools. How does your team get data in a Matic when the data doesn't live in a data warehouse or BI tool?
Yeah, that's a good question, Spencer. I will say that here at Asana, we're fortunate to have a data warehouse. So the majority of our data does come from a data warehouse. But I will say that there's several different ways that you can connect to Matic. I know you can get set up with a Salesforce if Salesforce is an app that you use. So I know Emily mentioned that earlier, that's something that they do. And then I also have experimented a little bit with importing data from Google Sheets. It's not something that, if we have a solution for in a data warehouse that I tend to like fall back on, but I do find it helpful for instances where you want to import some data that does not live in data warehouses, or maybe some data that we need to kind of like do some manipulation on directly in the spreadsheet.
Got it. I think the spreadsheet is the one we've seen most often, either with Excel or Google Sheets. I think that's, and to the point earlier made where you just want to test and iterate and, be messy. You can use that as a middle ground where you can, and not be messy, but be experimental, I guess is the more political way to say it. But you can use those spreadsheets as a middle ground and then connect it to a data source and get scale, but then also get the flexibility to be able to change that data source on the fly.
That's often a phase, like in my whole food chain I've described, right? Like part of that phase would actually be uploading the spreadsheet version of the data to Matic and automating it that way before the data feeds are actually ready. So we use that quite a bit at Zuora as well.
Great. Emily, I'd love to ask you, since you've been through this twice now, what was the implementation process like for Matic with you?
Yeah, it's interesting because my second implementation was not an implementation. I knew how to use Matic. I purchased it and I was like, cool, I'll let you know if I need anything, which honestly should let you know that like once you know it, it's truly one of the easiest platforms. I'm not going to like press this too hard, but when I started at this company, the first platform we asked for was Matic. Even though we did not have connection to a data lake, we did not have clean data yet. But going back to the first time that I implemented it, it takes a minute to understand the like, okay, what is conditional formatting versus what is dynamic content versus what is an input, right? Learning the terms, learning where things are, the sort of basic understanding a new platform. Kind of to give a shout out to your team, Spencer. I mean, honestly, I was meeting with my Matic account manager weekly to just learn this. And I'm not saying that you have to meet with them that regularly, but we were coming up with extremely creative ways to utilize this platform as robustly as we possibly could. But kind of just to give you an idea, if you've got the queries ready, because that's sort of separate from Matic, is building those queries, making sure they're right. If you have data in your Salesforce, have data in Gainsight, wherever you've got it, right? None of that is really specific to the Matic build. So once you get to the Matic part, it's really just being extremely specific with yourself about like, okay, here's everything I need in this deck. Here's everything I ask a customer success manager to update. And you just go through your deck and just update, create queries, put it in the deck, create a query, put it in the deck. And so honestly, it depends on, I would say, how complicated your initial decks that you want to run towards are. I think starting with simple stuff. I mean, I had our kickoff call deck here at Hummingbird up within 2 weeks of purchasing Matic. And that's with me doing minimal like amount of time in those 2 weeks. It's create the deck, it's upload it, it's, the queries you want from Salesforce, and then do it. The one thing that I'll say to kind of the maintenance of Matic is that there's almost none unless you are changing queries. So there's no, if your metrics are your metrics and they're going to stay the same for 6 months, you're probably not in there at all. Your users are, but you aren't.
I feel like Connor might disagree with that one, but but I think you are absolutely right. Where it goes in waves, how much time you're in Matic.
Right.
But it's really
Yes.
like when you're scaling content, you're going to be spending time in there. We do see less and less time in there as an admin as they scale more content, because it's just a lot easier to scale when you already have a lot of content. Sort of like you have all the raw materials, and then it's a lot easier to build the house rather than when you're building for the first time and you're just ordering everything and you got to build everything from scratch. So, but I think that is a nice segue to our last question. We'd love to, and you mentioned this a little bit, Emily, but we're actually just coming up on time. So I'll just ask this as a sort of a lightning round. What is the overhead and maintenance involved in Matic from your perspective? So, Jonathan, why don't we start with you? We'll go sort of lightning round around what your experience has been.
Yeah, very similar to what Emily said. Just like when things are up and running, almost no maintenance at all. It's really a question of how much you're iterating, the volume of iteration that you're trying to do. If we get things up and running the way I'm envisioning we will, then it's probably like an FTE, like an analyst FTE full time. You could dedicate to this, keeping things up to date and continuing the iteration in Matic. So, yeah.
And Connor, what's your experience been? I know you've got a bigger team involved in Matic, which in some ways makes it easier. In some ways, it has its own challenges introduced. We'd love to hear your perspective there.
Yeah, for sure. I'll say that, since I joined Asana and really since we rolled out Matic, the volume with which, our stakeholders are generating presentations has increased a ton. I'm talking like 3 or 4 times in the last year. And the level of maintenance that has been needed has not scaled at the same pace. It's been much slower. So I'll say that like Matic scales wonderfully. Like there is, there are sometimes things that go wrong with like upstream data tables that has nothing to do with Matic. I will say one of the great things about Matic is that you can actually account for these types of things sometimes. So like if something does go wrong, you can just like build logic into the slide, for example, that says like, hey, if this fails, don't return it. And so you can kind of like work around some of the issues that pop up in order to keep that maintenance down.
I love it. Yeah, like the fail safes. Yes, that is helpful, and that we use as someone who uses Matic myself, the ability to just be like, conditions, here's a slide condition. We're not going to show this slide. Great. Well, we're just up on time. Really loved having everyone's perspective here. This like flew by for me. Hopefully it was an equally good experience for you. But thank you, Emily. Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you, Connor, for joining. Really appreciate it. And we look forward to continuing to scale and work with you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Spencer.